It's one of the enduring memories of the 8-bit micro era, especially for people who are around about my age and got their start in the later years of the systems. I went to the Cornershop with me mum or dad, they had games there, and I tugged onto their pockets until they let me have one. The sort of memory a lot of us share, seeing as those games were only a couple of quid, and something that seems wild to later generations, or folks from the US or whatever who didn't have such luxuries. Not that we would have them if it weren't for the ridiculously cheap physical media that games for the Spectrum, C64 and Amstrad CPC came on, of course. That's why all these corner shops were filled with cassettes, after all. The budget market was strong throughout the life of the 8-bits, but became incredibly prominent by the end of the 80s, with tons of labels kicking around, and software houses that specialised in virtually nothing but budget games. Codemasters, Zeppelin, Mastertronic, Alternative, Atlantis, Players. These are names a lot of folk know very well. So yeah, budget labels weren't exactly new. There were always companies that concentrated purely on low-cost gaming for the masses, as opposed to full-price games. The entire history of microcomputing is filled with the promise of mega deals and compilation cassettes, from the early days of Automator's multi-program ZX81 offerings, to the perpetually advertised and unspeakably awful Cassette 50 from Cascade. But the late 80s offered up something different. Suddenly, the big dogs started to get in on the act, grabbing games out of their old archives and sending them out for another go-round on the budget circuit. That seems pretty innocuous at first, I'm sure. It's the sort of thing that's utterly normal now. But back then, it was kind of groundbreaking. The labels that the big companies used for these games almost became as famous as the mother brand, due to how ubiquitous and popular these re-releases were, and that's certainly the case with the main one that we're going to concentrate on, that being the Hit Squad, Ocean Software's contribution to the world of budget gaming. It's a special label that not only has a whole bunch of good games on it, but has an influential style of its own, ended up being far more important than the company initially intended, is highly popular with collectors, and has ended up collecting a fair few mysteries and holy grails over the years. And so, it's worth looking at. This video is sponsored by NerdCon. The event's a month away and plenty's going to be happening on the big day at Arcade Club in Bury on August 17th. There will be guest speakers. Gary Bracey, Ocean Software's director during the company's glory years, will be there to reminisce on the good old days. Brad Burton will be there to talk about the lessons he learned from gaming that have guided him through games journalism and motivational speaking, and I'll be there to do a Q&A filled with retro gaming wonder and chat about YouTube, long dead games companies and lots else I should think. With all the joys of the club as well as big challenges, bigger debates and lots of networking on offer, it's a hot ticket indeed. Go to nerdcon.co.uk if you'd like more information or to buy tickets, and I thank them for their support on this video. How did all of this get started? Well, the Hit Squad had its origins in compilations of big titles, which started to become a thing not too long after the micros got big. The Hit Squad name first appeared as early as 1985, in fact, on one of the most successful compilations of the day, They Sold a Million. At this time the label wasn't strictly Ocean Games, and indeed it would never be 100% Ocean. They Sold a Million was a collaboration between four of the industry's biggest names: Ocean, US Gold, Ultimate Play the Game, Software Projects. And the quartet of games is undoubtedly impressive. A tenner buys you Daley Thompson's Decathlon, Beachhead, Saberwolf and Jet Set Willy. Not bad really if you didn't have them already. They are four of the most successful and greatest micro games. The only problem perhaps is that C64 owners got lumped with the staff of Carnath instead of Saberwolf, because Ultimate didn't do a great deal on that machine. Even so, They Sold a Million was a pretty huge success. There'd be so many more of these compilations released by other software houses, but this was unquestionably one of the most popular ones. There would be two other releases in the They Sold a Million series, with both number 2 and 3 kind of suffering from diminishing returns. The second compilation isn't too bad. You get Match Day, Match Point, Bruce Lee, and either Nightlaw or Entombed, depending on the platform. Another quartet of perfectly decent games then. You can't go too on here. The third one kind of goes off the cliff a bit. That's Daley Thompson's Super Test or Rambo, Fighter Pilot, Ghostbusters, and Kung Fu Master. I mean, God knows what that bloody disaster of a port's doing there. The Lay Sold a Million idea lost steam as companies concentrated on their own compilations, and so it ended up taking a bit of a rest following 1987. That is, until 1989, when Ocean Software revived the Hit Squad for their own budget label. They weren't the first big micro company to start up a budget label, as it goes. Perpetual frenemies and distribution giant US Gold flexed their Centresoft muscle to start up Kix in 1988, and a lot of the other labels kicking around would spawn from there, from the Hit Squad to Gremlins GBH, Elite's Encore, and Virgin Mastertronics Ricochet. But the Hit Squad would become the most famous. There isn't a whole lot to the label's history, really. Aside from Ocean starting it up in 1989 and it becoming a success beyond their highest expectations, ultimately becoming a label that would swallow up and release games from other companies like Domark, Titus and System 3 who didn't have their own budget branding, not to mention grabbing the embers from companies that fell by the wayside such as Electric Dreams, the micro-win of Activision in the Mediagenic era. The Hit Squad label would continue to be a thing through the 16-bit era on the Amiga and Atari ST, but generally it's the 8-bit releases that hold people's interest a lot more, particularly the games on the big three, Speccy, C64 and CPC. The three platforms all ended up with a bit over 100 releases each, and right from the start of the label there was a focus on being that cool-ass guy, the one who could collect them all. Even more than the games themselves, the collectible aspect was crucial to the label's success. So how do you really dress up these old games for budget stardom? You've obviously got a lot less packaging, you've got a cheaper quality tape, and an inlay that'll rip as soon as you look at it. Margins are a bit tighter around these parts. Well, the key here is uniformity, something that us Brits in particular have kind of a soft spot for. The Hit Squad games all come with a very specific scheme, the same font, the same colours, the same style, all designed to look fabulous on your shelf when they're bundled together. There is a little bit more to it than that though. All of the 8-bit Hit Squad releases, almost all of them, are numbered and categorised. You've got 3 categories, arcade, movies and sports, and they all have a nice code. Meaning, for example, that the almighty Enduro Racer is Arcade 1, or A1, Robocop is M22, Hypersports is S5, and so on. The 16-bit Hit Squad releases didn't have this coding scheme, and the 8-bit Hit Squad releases are far more desirable because of it. The Spectrum and Amstrad CPC lists are pretty much the same, although there are a few more differences in the C64's Hit Squad list thanks to games that were exclusive to that platform, such as Parallax, which is Arcade 9 on Commodore. You also get a tiny amount of numbered Hit Squad releases on other 8-bit platforms. There's a few lurking around for the BBC Micro, Commodore 16 or Plus 4, Atari 800 and the MSX, but generally the big 3 8-bit micros are where the action is. There are also a couple of 8-bit micro releases that aren't coded, specifically Pictionary, Trivial Pursuit and the Fun School titles, because they don't fit into the big 3 initial categories. Other than that, well, the coding's good to go. Ocean really mastered this sort of uniform branding with the Hit Squad, although it's not like that's something exclusive to them. Indeed, you find this sort of branding all over certain software houses in the era. Look at Codemasters releases, for example. They all have a very similar form, especially the simulator titles. The other big budget re-release label, Kix, also had a specific style, that trellis background. They all fit together. Cover tapes too, particularly the ones from the Newsfield publications like Crash and Zap64, are all incredibly uniform. There are a lot of collectors who really specialise in trying to obtain a full set of these specific things thanks to the uniform branding. I have to credit this analogy to Martin Carroll, who wrote an excellent retrospective on the Hit Squad in the pages of Retro Gamer issue number 160 that, frankly, was very essential to doing this video, but these collections strike a certain chord with people. It's like being in the playground once again and looking to fill up an album full of Panini football stickers, not feeling quite complete until, by hook or by crook, you've managed to grab them all. I wonder if Ocean hoped that school kids would be trading Hit Squad tapes in the playground, the monotone mantra of got, need, got, echoing around as people helped each other to fill the holes in their collection. Now that obviously didn't happen, but a series like the Hit Squad does scratch the same itch. Now while I'm not sure if this is the case, I wonder if the identikit branding of the Hit Squad and labels like it had a bigger impact than people might have initially realised. People have always been curious about the difference between the branding of PlayStation games in Europe as opposed to everywhere else, the expressive logos of games being thoroughly eschewed in favour of a plain yet bold spine with imposing text, and even a fairly prominent spot for the game's code, the SLES whatever. This more generic branding may well be loathed by some, but it does look impressive when you've got a whole bunch of them all together. Was a part of that branding influenced by labels like the Hit Squad and how popular their re-releases ended up being? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a theme that you can kind of track when you look at various physical releases, including formats and styles that have been embraced worldwide, such as what you find with games on the Nintendo Switch. Going back to the Hit Squad, of course, nothing's going to be perfect. There are some releases that are a trifle maddening for collectors, ones that mess with the branding a little bit, ones that indicate that a teeny weeny little screw up was made. I imagine that if I asked a bunch of Hit Squad collectors what their least favourite game in the entire range would be, that the answer I would get back would be the original Batman game. Now this has nothing to do with the quality of the game, you understand, the game's a classic, but the inlay of the game, for some reason, has the game's freaking logo instead of the usual red text. Calamity! What an absolute eyesore. It's almost as bad as that one bastard EA PS2 game that centres the title of the game as opposed to left a line in it like every other PS2 release ever. Oh well, some folks have to be different, don't they? Other irritants include the complete lack of a Movie 6 on C64. Instead there are two Movie 7s, Predator and Miami Vice. Quite simply, someone messed up. Oh, and what about the case of the almighty Last Ninja 2? You may be a bit flummoxed to find that Last Ninja is in the sports section. Mind you, this may well be intentional. Other martial arts-centric titles seem to be there too. IK+, Shaolin's Road, and Yaya Kung Fu are apparently sports games, which is, kinda questionable. However, errors aside, there are some other intriguing Hit Squad mysteries out there. Of course, you do have the games that are difficult to find and a bit more expensive than the rest, and those are worth looking at. But other titles have puzzled people for years. Do they exist or don't they? Games like these represent some of the biggest holy grails for micro collectors, and they should be poked into a little further. The title of this section is a play on the traditional Hit Squad slogan, top quality games at rock bottom prices, so it went. Now if you were to decide that you wanted a full Hit Squad collection, you would probably do fine when it came to a pretty decent chunk of the set. A great deal of Hit Squad games were printed in large numbers, are very common and easy to find, and can be yours for a few quid. Cool enough, huh? However, actually completing the set is a different story. There are some right bastards out there, prints of games that are very rare, and as such they're very expensive. Now that's not a surprise, of course. Other collectors for specific brands run into similar troubles, especially with the later games in the series. Take the almighty prices that the Spectrum releases of DJ Puff and Wrestling Superstars, two very late 8-bit games by Codemasters, command. Yes, it may be a bad game on a grotty cassette tape, encased in a cheap inlay and a beyond fragile case, but if you want these two games, well, you'll have to pay over 100 quid for each of them. And there's Hit Squad releases out there that are worth way more than that, usually games that are amongst the last ones in the range. Darkman on the Spectrum, for example, may set you back a couple of £100. Lethal Weapon on the C64 or the Spectrum Adams family? That might cost you even more. Lethal Weapon in particular is, in all likelihood, the final 8-bit Hit Squad release full stop, and considering that the C64 version of the game is kind of a late obscurity to begin with, you can imagine just how frickin' rare this one is. Both it and Adams Family tend to go for a few £100s. There is one other game still that might actually be even rarer, mind, but we'll get to that. Some other oddities in the Hit Squad range include a couple of games that actually only existed on their own in the budget range, never actually getting their own full release. Hard Driving for the C64 is one of these, for example. Initially this was only released as part of a compilation called Wheels on Fire before getting a budget re-release on Hit Squad. Now, considering that this is quite possibly the very worst attempt at a racing game that there has ever been, perhaps it softens the blow a little to know that it was never actually sold for full price. Then again, perhaps not. Still, another one of the most talked about Hit Squad titles may well be one that was never released at all, and is undoubtedly the most elusive one of the lot. It's a release that potentially does speak a lot towards just how long companies decided to reissue old games on the 8-bit micros for. A title that was reviewed by magazines in January of 1994 and advertised to be out around then. Yes, Commodore magazines were still available at such a late stage. The game in question here is Cool World. Again, by itself this is an incredibly late 8-bit release, possibly even the final new game that Ocean released for the Commodore 64, full stop. Because it's so late, it's wild to even think of the possibility of the game being reissued. It sounds quite ludicrous for an 8-bit game like this one, that can't have sold much to begin with, coming back so late into the 16-bit era. But it was indeed reviewed and advertised. The reissue of Cool World even got a double-page spread in Commodore Force, although I imagine that's partly because there was precious little in the way of Commodore news and new games to cover at around this time. In any case, well, no one's ever seen much of it since. Now, the glaringly obvious answer here is that the Hit Squad Cool World never came out at all. Someone sensible put their hand up and said that putting this game out again was completely and utterly pointless. It wouldn't be the first time a prospective Hit Squad release ended up getting pulled. You do have little tidbits, advertising and even reviews for reissues like Joffa Smith's Firefly, The Legend of Kage, Galaxy Force, Passing Shot, Time Scanner. However, while some people occasionally wonder about these titles, it is easy enough to discount them because there were other Hit Squad titles after them and they don't fit into the collection's number scheme. They were obviously not released at all. Cool World is different because if it had come out, it would have been the new final entry. It would presumably have been Movie 32, coming out after Lethal Weapon. Simply because there's nothing else after Cool World, it's trickier to discount it, and people still wonder about it simply because of that, even if, in all likelihood, it was never released. Certainly no one has ever popped up to show off their copy of it. If a copy of this release does exist somewhere, well, it would certainly be a holy grail of sorts. It would be worth way more even than Lethal Weapon, which is already in serious nosebleed territory for an 8-bit micro title. Hundreds if not thousands of pounds. Not bad for a mediocre game based on a lousy flop film, really. Another thing you might be wondering about these Hit Squad titles is if anything about the games was changed between the original release and the Hit Squad version. Say if there was something that got removed or edited because of licensing or whatnot. Now, generally speaking, the answer is no. As far as what the average player would take notice of, a Hit Squad release of a game would nearly always be the exact same as the original release. The game's covers are even mostly the same aside from the Hit Squad branding, although IK Plus is an exception. Here the better known original cover is changed to the 16-bit computer version cover that includes unofficial cameos from Steven Seagal, Chuck Norris and Jean-Claude Van Damme. A lot of 80s box art features these unofficial cameos, look at Navy Moves and Grisor for other examples in the Hit Squad range, but this one takes the piss somewhat. It's worth noting that there would be a few changes behind the scenes when it came to how games loaded. A person who knew a fair bit about that was Paul Hughes, who worked on Freeload, better known as the ocean loader that C64 owners loved so much, a program that delivered iconic tunes in the front and worked various protection schemes and crafty interrupts behind the scenes that were designed to thwart hackers and people with freeze cartridges who may have been looking to make copies. Said protection schemes would often change with the Hit Squad releases, and in fact the whole loader program had to be changed for the Hit Squad release, resulting in loading times that were a bit slower than the original releases. One upshot of this is that a fair few C64 games that used the modified Hit Load program didn't actually have the iconic loading music at all, simply because it didn't fit anymore, which is a bit of a shame. Others did have a piece that was a bit longer than the other loaders, mind you, and could fit in. I wonder if this may have been Martin Galway's Ocean Loader 2, seeing as it's a minute longer than most of the others, but that also seems a trifle early for Hit Squad games. Another wee little mystery, at least for folks who enjoy these more technical aspects of releases that you wouldn't normally pay any attention to. The legacy of the Hit Squad and other budget re-release labels like it is possibly a little hazy. I mean, I could project a bit on their branding possibly influencing Sony in Europe, and I have done, but I'm not sure if that's the case. For the 8-bit gaming press at the time, the arrival of these labels didn't necessarily seem like a good thing. For a start, nobody likes having to cover games that they've already covered previously, and also, well, some people may have seen the arrival of the Hit Squad, kicks and what have you, as a sign that the systems had reached the beginning of the end, people sending out old games back again for one last bit of cash. It's not too big a leap from that to sending games off to the cover tapes and starting the cover tape wars, I suppose. Now of course, greatest hits labels would soon not be such a harbinger of doom. Sony, again, ran PlayStation Platinum as an evolving thing, not too long after the console came out, and existing through most of the system's run. But yet, on the whole, the mag's opinion of these labels was not all that positive. It does bring up one question, mind, something that came up when I was asking people for ideas on angles to cover a budget label like the Hit Squad, where the games themselves aren't the main focus. One thing about magazines looking at reissues is that it necessitates a second review, and an opportunity to see if the opinions on a game had changed at all. That's always curious. Now of course it's not perfect, it's pretty likely after all that two wholly different reviewers are going to be on these assignments, and they may have wildly varying opinions. Even so, it is fun to see. So of the 122 unique Hit Squad games, what titles got a seriously different reappraisal on their second go-round? So, you would probably be surprised at how few of the games did get a serious second look, really. Most of the games scored almost the exact same on their second review as they did on their first, in fact, with only a couple of percentage points difference. Perhaps magazines didn't necessarily want to look as though they'd changed their minds too much, or, more accurately, not a whole lot of time was put into these re-reviews, because as stated previously, mags were far more interested in covering games that were actually new, which is fair enough. You see more differences in scores really when you look at the later games in the range. By the time these ones came out in 1993 or whatever, there wasn't much new to cover, and so a bit more depth had to be put into the re-review just to fill pages. And so a game like Terminator 2, which got scores in the high 80s, ends up getting a much more deserved 48% kick-in from Your Sinclair in January of 1993. WWF WrestleMania also gets a proper stinging from the same mag, dropping down to 54 from an original 91. The Spy Who Loved Me gets cracked in the mouth, it went from 76 to a dreadful 26, and again, that's Your Sinclair. On the other side, the rather obscure port of Taito's Space Gun gets a jump from YS, going from a mediocre 62% in April 1992 to a very credible 87% in May of 1993. It seems like Your Sinclair were the only ones willing to make such shifts, really. Crash and Sinclair user scores always seem to be nearly identical. Now, while it's generally easier for me to look through the archives of Specky scores, thanks to sites like Spectrum Computing, I can still have a little look over the archives of some C64 and Amstrad magazines to see what was happening over there. In the case of the almighty Zap64, again, most of the time there's not a huge difference. Good games remain good, and bad games remain bad. Some big games do take a bit of a hit, with Robocop on C64 getting cut down from 89% to 77%, although you may be surprised to find that the re-review doesn't note the game being virtually impossible to finish, which wasn't fixed for the Hit Squad re-release, naturally. Still, Zap's re-reviews tend to take note of the original review for each game and see whether the title still holds up, which is very nice to see. They certainly put a good effort in for the budget portion of the mag. It should be noted that Zap themselves do provide a handy way to look at some scores in the pages of their very last few editions as Commodore Force in late 93 and early 94. The Back to the feature presents a whole bunch of original scores and re-release scores, and we can see that the likes of Stun Runner dropped a whole 30 points, or that Red Heat went from 65 to 27%. As for games significantly improving their mark, yeah, that just doesn't really happen. But it is a cool little retrospective, mind you. As for Amstrad mags, well, I've got a bunch of scores from Amstrad Action, and that has some quite shocking differences. It often seems like the re-releases always seem to go down, and quite harshly. Take Head Over Heels, for example. This much-loved isometric adventure originally received 95% in 1987, being called a master game. When reappraised in 1990, it only scored 62. That's pretty brutal, it has to be said, and kind of excessive. Even the excellent port of Arkanoid gets a pretty harsh treatment, losing 9 whole points despite easily being the best official port on the 3 big micros. So yeah, these second looks can get a bit harsh. It is kind of amusing also to see games like Renegade 3 still scoring well on their second review, even though it's, well, utter rubbish, putting it kindly. Hey ho. So, that's about all there is to say, really. The Hit Squad are a memorable label, even if there's not a huge amount to their story, and hopefully you've enjoyed a look at some of the various quirks of the releases and how potentially influential they were. It is certainly a special subject for gamers of my generation. There is one other little thing to do, perhaps. I'm always fond of doing a compendium of sorts, and plenty of you are surely interested in seeing every Hit Squad game, the 8-bit ones at least. And we're going to do that. The documentary bit is done, so here's the coverage, a little look at all 122 unique Hit Squad 8-bit games. Now, obviously these games weren't originally Hit Squad titles, and a lot have been covered already by me, so what I'm going to do is keep quiet and let the games speak for themselves, while also giving you the requisite box art and Hit Squad codes for each platform. Hopefully you enjoy this library of Hit Squad classics and not so classics, and I'll see you in the next video. But until then, have fun.